Benjamin Norton is a journalist, a writer, a filmmaker, founder and editor of the independent media outlet Multipolarista, where he reports in both English and Spanish. His journalism focuses primarily on US foreign policy and geopolitics, and he has reported from many countries around the world and is currently based in Latin America. It's my pleasure to invite Ben Norton to close off our panel today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. I really enjoyed listening to all of the analysis, and I look forward to the questions. I think we should understand the convoy in Canada as part of a larger international phenomenon. And while the neoliberal order is collapsing, this is the stage of capitalism that developed in the late 70s, the 1980s with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, of course, and it became international. I think when we see the collapse of neoliberalism, there are several different responses. There is, of course, the progressive socialist critique of neoliberalism, but there increasingly are right-wing critiques of neoliberalism that are gaining influence. And you could also say that they're not just right-wing, they are far-right and even fascistic critiques of neoliberalism. And I think in Canada, this is an example of what we've seen in the United States really in the past several years. And I think the analysis that several other panelists had provided of the possibility of a fascist regime in the United States trying to absorb, to annex, to colonize Canada, I think actually is not a crazy idea at all. I think that's actually something that is quite plausible. And we should also understand that these far-right networks in North America and internationally are well connected. And specifically in the case of Canada, one of the most prominent, influential fascist organizations in the United States was founded by a Canadian, by Gavin McInnes, who founded the Proud Boys, which is a fascist gang in the US that has been implicated in hate crimes and violence. And Gavin McInnes refers to himself as a Western chauvinist. But I think Gavin McInnes is an interesting character because I think he kind of reflects this phenomenon that I was addressing of a right-wing, far-right response to neoliberalism. And we see this in the United States with the attempt to try to create this concept of the populist right. And I think, the word populism itself is extremely arbitrary. It is never clearly defined. It certainly is not a form of class politics. In fact, usually populism is a cross-class politics that calls on people to unite, workers with the capitalists in pursuit of some cultural goal that distracts from historical materialist reality. And we see this so clearly with the attempt in the United States to try to create this idea of a populist right, not only with Donald Trump, who is frequently referred to as a populist, but now with this new generation of Republicans who fancy themselves intellectuals, although, how many books they've actually read is quite, I think, up for debate. Like J.D. Vance is someone I'm thinking of. This guy, J.D. Vance, has portrayed himself as a populist Republican. He just won the primary for the Republican Party in Ohio, which is a state that is contested. It's known as a purple state between the Republicans and the Democrats. J.D. Vance, who actually got his start criticizing Appalachia from a cultural perspective, not an economic critique of the uneven development within the United States in terms of how Appalachia was exploited by the fossil fuel industry, specifically the coal industry. He wrote this book, Hillbilly Elegy, that was a culturalist critique of the economic backwardness of Appalachia that framed it in terms of people supposedly being lazy and basically kind of reiterating these stereotypes of poor people supposedly not working hard enough. J.D. Vance later rebranded as an ardent Trump supporter after initially criticizing Trump and a so-called populist right-winger, populist Republican. And he has even gone so far as to critique elements of neoliberal orthodoxy. And he's not the only one. We've also seen far-right figures like Tucker Carlson, who has the most popular, at least in terms of ratings, the most watched TV show in the United States on Fox News. Tucker Carlson likewise has been called a so-called populist and does have a far-right critique of neoliberalism. And these critiques tend to be critiques that criticize neoliberalism and even elements of capitalism, for instance, for allowing liberalization of immigration policy, for encouraging women to join the marketplace. Of course, not to join the workforce, not of course because capitalists care in any way about women's rights, on the contrary, but this is a right-wing critique of neoliberalism and even capitalism for breaking down feudal relations. So in many ways, this kind of so-called populist right, or these far-right movements, are in some ways even neo-feudal. And I think there's definitely a way we can analyze fascism as having elements of neo-feudalism. So in terms of the trucker convoy, the so-called trucker convoy, organized by non-truckers, funded by people outside of Canada largely, especially in the United States. And we have reports now showing that the funding from the United States to the convoy in Canada came disproportionately from wealthy suburbs that are the bases for Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So this is clearly a concerted attempt to try to create this concept of a so-called populist right. And Justin Trudeau, in many ways, is the perfect target for them. This is a man who is thoroughly neoliberal. His economic program is in no way progressive. And I'm sure no one here actually supports Trudeau, despite the supporters of the convoy trying to portray leftist critics of the convoy as supposed Trudeau supporters. And Trudeau is also the perfect target in the sense of he has mastered this new politic of these liberal politicians who will instrumentalize very important struggles like the struggle against patriarchy and racism and LGBT oppression, but doing so within a thoroughly neoliberal framework and a thoroughly imperialist framework, supporting the right-wing US-led, Trump-led coup attempt against Venezuela and acting on behalf of the United States and the so-called Lima Group to overthrow the leftist government of Venezuela, also supporting the war in Yemen and supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia to help carry out this war that has led to at least 377,000 Yemeni deaths. So Trudeau is in many ways the perfect target because he is in no way a left-wing politician, but he does use this kind of progressive identitarian rhetoric, which allows this so-called populist right, which is also in many ways neoliberal. Despite their critiques of neoliberalism, they have no economic program to actually challenge neoliberalism, other than some critiques of corporate culture, criticizing corporations for supposedly being woke, because some corporations have found that it's in their economic interest to criticize racism or police brutality or something because they're trying to go after many young customers, and young people tend to be very susceptible to these critiques of systemic racism and the horrible outcomes that we've seen of capitalism and neoliberalism in North America. So I also think it's important to understand those critiques in a larger international context. And here in the last few minutes of my presentation, I want to take that analysis even further from the bogus attempt to create a so-called populist right that has no economic program and tries to move all political struggle onto a cultural terrain, into the so-called culture war, and has effectively instrumentalized critiques of the failure of the neoliberal response to this global pandemic. I mean, we don't see, of course, critiques of the US government for allowing more than 1 million people to die from COVID. Of course, instead the critiques are that people had to wear masks to the extent that they even did. In many of these parts of the United States, they didn't have to, or that in some places they had to get vaccinated. Although again, in the US, that was never really implemented in many states. But that also helps them keep the struggle away from the economic terrain and to focus on these cultural battles in the so-called culture war. But I think we also need to understand that this is an international phenomenon, not just limited to North America, where we see the rise of attempts to create a so-called populist right that has some critiques of neoliberalism, but fails to implement any economic alternative. We see this in Eastern Europe with figures like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or in Poland with the Law and Justice Party, which make these vague critiques of big corporations and neoliberal policies. Well, in many ways, their economic policies are also thoroughly neoliberal, but they justify those from a conservative political framework. And some of these parties have even fancied themselves social conservative parties. And I think, again, we can see this, the so-called convoy as something that comes in a similar line of this attempt to try to create this vague veneer of a right, a political right that is anti-establishment. They love using the term anti-establishment. They don't say against the ruling class. They certainly don't say against the capitalist class. They're against this vague concept of the establishment. And then they try to argue that the bourgeoisie is thoroughly liberal. And of course, it is liberal if you understand liberalism as what it actually means. But of course, when they say liberal, they mean liberal with a capital L. And the reality is that they're also liberals with a lowercase l, which is why they have a critique of neoliberalism, but are unable to break out of the economic model of neoliberalism because their critiques are not economic critiques. And I think the most interesting parallel here is looking also at Brazil. And I mentioned in Eastern Europe with the rise of these so-called social conservative parties, but Brazil is another interesting example of that. I mean, India also, by the way, I should say, which is a whole other concept for another time. The BJP party, which is a far-right party, which is also thoroughly neoliberal, has tried to make these similar critiques while also in no ways actually diverging from the neoliberal model. And we've even seen that some of these supporters of the far-right Hindutva movement in India have even tried to make a right-wing critique of colonialism by basically saying that if you oppose this chauvinist idea of creating a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu state against the large Muslim minority and other religious minorities in India, well, it's because you're a racist and you're a Hindu phobe and you're a colonialist who is against the pure Hindu culture of Hindustan, of India. So another way in which this so-called populist right has manifested itself internationally. And I want to keep in mind here that what does BJP mean in Hindi? It means the People's Party of India, which is, again, we see this around the world. We see in Canada, the so-called People's Party, which tries to portray itself as so-called populist, which is also economically neoliberal, and it's far right, but portrays itself as oppositional to neoliberalism. And finally, the last example I'm going to end my discussion with here is that of Brazil. And I think this is the most interesting example in terms of the direct parallels to the convoy in Canada. Again, a convoy led by non-truckers, in which the main organizers were far-right Canadian operatives in a country in which 90% of truckers are vaccinated and in which all of the major unions, including Teamsters, the leading truckers union, came out forcefully against this convoy. And briefly here, I just want, if I can share my screen, I just want to show an article briefly. I'm just going to summarize it in short. An article that I published on my website, Multipolarista, which was co-written by a friend and colleague of mine, Brian Meir, who is a longtime Brazil-based journalist. He's lived in Brazil for over half his life, for over 30 years. And he originally comes from the United States. And actually, interestingly, his brother is a trucker. And he knows very well about the horrible conditions that truckers are subjected to in North America, having to work long hours with few benefits, with decreasing wages. So this article is interesting because Brian used his experience in Brazil to talk about the very many parallels between the convoy in Canada and similar things that happened in Brazil. And for people who want to look this up, you can find this at Multipolarista. It's called "From Canada to Brazil: Rich Right-Wing Elites Are Astroturfing So-Called Trucker Protests." I want to go down here to a photo of Brazil's far-right president, fascist president in the middle, Jair Bolsonaro, who only came to power in 2018 because the United States backed a judicial coup that imprisoned the left-wing candidate Lula da Silva on completely bogus charges. And now the UN Human Rights Committee, the legal experts at the UN, have determined that Lula was arbitrarily detained and that it violated his political rights. This photo shows Bolsonaro with his son Eduardo, but it also shows him with a former Trump advisor who is a close ally of Steve Bannon. His name is Jason Miller. Steve Bannon has helped to create these far-right networks, these neo-fascistic networks, and he's been very active in Brazil, in Europe, and they organized a very similar so-called trucker protest in Brazil just a few months ago. And in this article, we talk about how in September, there was a meeting of the so-called Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, which is a right-wing conference in the United States held every year. And they exported that with the same name, they even used the English language name. They didn't even translate it into Portuguese. They called it CPAC Brazil. And this conference featured Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo, seen on the right in this photo. It also featured Donald Trump Jr. He was supposed to speak in person, but he ended up being delayed and actually spoke via video stream. But the point is that it brought together the son of Donald Trump and the son of Bolsonaro, both of these far-right presidents. And this CPAC Brazil conference came just a few days before an organized protest that was modeled after the January 6th insurgency in the U.S. Capitol, in which Trump supporters, they raided the U.S. Capitol and tried to overturn the election results. And in Brazil, they tried to do something very similar in September, where they paralyzed the capital Brazil. Not capitalized they paralyzed the capital Brasilia, and then thousands of Bolsonaro supporters stormed the Supreme Court building. And this is also part of an attempt to try to rig the elections on behalf of Bolsonaro. So once again, we see parallels here where the far right is international. They're working together. There are some of the same people involved in these networks, including people like Steve Bannon and allies like Jason Miller. And then what's very important about this event is not only was it modeled after January 6th in the United States, but it was also an attempt to instrumentalize the concept of trucker rights, the idea that truckers are, being oppressed. Ironically, Bolsonaro was president, but this goes back to they say that these policies created by the Workers' Party and all of this, they supposedly violate the rights of truckers. When they say truckers, they mean owner-operators. They mean not working-class truckers. They mean their bosses who hire them to drive the actual buses. And we saw that at this attempt to storm the Supreme Court building, there was this big protest featuring dozens of identical trucks. And it was later disclosed that these trucks all belonged to one of the main campaign funders of Jair Bolsonaro, whose name is Marlon Bonilla. And this so-called trucker protest, it was organized by a man who calls himself Se Troao. That's not his real name. That's just the nickname he gave himself. And it was later revealed that not only was he not a trucker, he didn't even have a driver's license, but he did receive thousands of dollars from Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo. And here in the article, you can see this is a photo. And what he did, this Bolsonaro supporter, Se Troao, he called himself a trucker. He put on this hat and he wore a vest. It's also similar to the vest used in the yellow vest protests in France, which is another complex discussion, but it's related to this. And he had a big Brazilian flag behind him in these YouTube videos. And he had these long rants about cultural Marxism and the Workers' Party and how they're destroying the country. And he said, I'm a worker, I'm a trucker, and join me in the capital, Brasilia, and we're going to fight on behalf of freedom and all this nonsense. Of course, as I said, it was late. Here's an example of their rhetoric of these truckers who, again, they were hired by a multimillionaire who's one of the main donors to Jair Bolsonaro. And they had these large banners that were professionally printed that said, "We demand a new federal constitution that incorporates anti-communism." They wanted to make it illegal to be a communist, which, by the way, was incorporated into Ukraine after the US-backed coup in 2014. So we see how much the liberal so-called rules-based international order cares about civil liberties for the left. But anyway, finally concluding here, this is some of the reporting from Brian Meir that shows, again, the direct parallels between these strategies used by the far right internationally. Exactly what they were doing in Canada is exactly what they were also doing in Brazil. Here you can see a photo of Marlon Bonilla, the multimillionaire owner of the trucking company called ProTorque that brought dozens of trucks to the Capitol for this protest. And here's a photo of him giving Jair Bolsonaro a motorcycle helmet. And then here he talks about this guy, Se Troao, and he quotes a strike leader who was president of a transport strike. And he says he's referring to this guy who was called himself a trucker and led the so-called trucker protest in Canada. He said, "This guy made a video inside of a truck, but we don't know him. I've been in this business for 22 years. This guy just arrived by parachute." So the reason I wanted to go into that example is because we need to understand that these tactics being used in Canada are not novel. The far right is international. This attempt to create a so-called populist right, as cynical as it was, as I talked about earlier, is international. And not only are they using the same tactics, many of the same networks and individuals are involved in organizing, backing these campaigns.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.